In the Gaza war, people of largely Muslim faith are being bombed, starved, and driven from their homes. And unsurprisingly, that means it's brought a lot of extreme Islamophobes out of the woodwork. This is Douglas Murray speaking to US talking head Dave Rubin.
These are enemies within. We have our own ones in Britain like this. And as I say, you have to work out at some point where where your system is being gamed. And it's being gamed in America. It's being gamed much more, and it has been gamed for much longer in the UK. But I mean, you see it in things like, for instance, the First Minister of Scotland, Hamza Yusuf. He's married to a Palestinian. She's a particularly nasty piece of work, who has been on the record before smearing the Jewish state in all sorts of ways. Her parents are in Gaza. Hamza Yusuf, as far as I can see, is not the First Minister of Scotland. He's become the First Minister of Gaza, or an ambassador for Gaza, or something like that.
Yeah. He thinks Scotland's too white.
He thinks also that Scotland should take in the people of Gaza as refugees. In the Scotland of my youth, I think we would have been amazed at the idea that by the year 2023, we would have a First Minister calling for the importing of people from one of the world's most radical statelets, not yet states, encampments, cities, strips. But people like Hamza Yusuf have, I said carefully, but have infiltrated our system. He does not seem to be much bothered by the situation of the Scottish people, of the people of Glasgow, who have one of the lowest life expectancies, not just in Britain, but anywhere in Europe. He does not seem to care about that, or if he does nothing about it. But my word, if you look at his social media proclamations and everything else, you would think that he was indeed First Minister of Gaza.
It's just so racist, right? He's infiltrated our system. Right? He was elected leader of the SNP, who got the most votes in a democratic election to become the largest party in Holyrood. He is now the First Minister. Infiltration has nothing to do with anything. He was democratically elected. He has a lot more legitimacy than Douglas Murray does, speaking there like this sort of racist drunk. Right? The amount of hatred in his voice when he's talking about Hamza Yusuf's wife, right? A particularly nasty person. It's just despicable. First Minister of Gaza as well. If people were on Twitter sort of calling Keir Starmer the First Minister of Israel, they would immediately get called out as being anti-Semitic, right? Immediately. And this guy, First Minister of Gaza, and especially if anyone said that about a Jewish politician, they said they were First Minister of Israel, they would definitely be called anti-Semitic. He's saying this about someone with connections to Gaza. Obviously, we've talked about Hamza Yusuf on this show before. He has spoken with such even-handed empathy when it comes to the crisis in Gaza, to the bombardment of Gaza, that I have the utmost respect for him. And then not only to be smeared, his family to be smeared, but then told he has infiltrated British society when he was elected to his position is just despicable. It's disgusting. Now, one might think statements like that would mean people in polite society would be wary of associating with Douglas Murray. But 3 days after that video was published, the Jewish Chronicle published an article by Murray, and this is the headline: "Why must Jews watch their backs as London mobs cheer?" And in the piece he wrote this: "This is one occasion when saying that some people are worse than the Nazis is not hyperbole. Average members of the SS and other killing units of Hitler's were rarely proud of their average day's work. Very few felt that shooting Jews in the back of the head all day and kicking up their bodies into pits was where their own lives had meant to end up. Many spent their evenings getting blind drunk to try to forget. Nazi commanders had to worry about staff morale. When the war ended, the Nazis tried to pretend that Treblinka and other death camps never existed. Compare this with the behaviour of Hamas on October the 7th. As those of us who have viewed the raw footage from the day have seen and heard up for ourselves, these terrorists were not just pleased with what they were doing, they were elated. They spent the whole time screaming Allahu Akbar with delight." So we have here in a Jewish newspaper, I think the oldest Jewish newspaper in the world, a non-Jew who happens to be very right-wing, arguing that the Nazis, who killed 6 million Jews, at least felt bad when they did it. Right? They still had some sort of morals to them because they felt bad when they did it. Now, of course, there's little evidence that they did feel bad when they did it. The Holocaust absolutely did involve the celebration of racist violence. Did Murray think that Kristallnacht involved people sort of moving around, looking at their feet, upset and reluctantly smashing up synagogues and rounding up Jews? No. and this is the most ridiculous bit, they didn't hide the truth about concentration camps because they were ashamed. It was because they didn't want to get tried for war crimes, right? It wasn't suddenly that, maybe whoopsie-daisy, maybe it was as a mistake to kill millions of Jews in concentration camps. Should we cover that up because we're a bit embarrassed? They were trying to avoid getting the death sentence in a war crimes tribunal, right? It's just so ahistorical. And for that to be in the Jewish Chronicle by a guy who has said that about the Scottish First Minister 3 days prior, it is just, it's difficult to believe. I mean, of course, the Nazis and Hamas in another way are incomparable, whatever you think of their aims or tactics, right? And I think much of what was done on October the 7th was horrific and unjustifiable. And Hamas have many aims I completely disagree with. But they are part of a movement with a legitimate grievance. Israel has been illegally occupying Palestine for 56 years, and Palestinians have a right to resist that. The Nazis, on the other hand, right, they weren't part of any movement by any understanding where there was a legitimate grievance or just cause. They were trying to exterminate an ethnic minority. Their genocidal project was based on a belief in their own racial supremacy. And by using the entire force of a sophisticated military state, they got close to wiping out all of Europe's Jews. It was the worst genocide in history. Hamas and the Nazis are incomparable. The comparison is offensive. And we've seen more of Douglas Murray because he's gone to the Middle East to cosplay as a war reporter. And he brought up the Nazis again in an interview with Piers Morgan on Talk TV, where he was speaking from close to the Gaza border.
I can tell you one thing. The comparison between Hamas and the Nazis is insufficient. And sorry, there's an incoming.
Get safe, Douglas.
Come.
Are you okay, Douglas?
It came from the other direction, so okay. Anyhow, we're okay.
Are you okay?
Let's just it's fine. Sorry, it was a rocket coming. It looked like it was just going to land on us here.
Which way was that rocket coming from? Was it coming from Gaza or from Israel?
Yes, it seemed to be coming from Gaza. So yeah, it's fine. It's okay. It's been happening all day. Let me just finish this point, if I may.
Before we go on, Douglas, Atman, how does that make you? How does that make you feel? What just happened there?
I mean, it's I'm a little used to it. I was in Ukraine last year and was in Kherson and Odessa and Mykolaiv, and when the Russians were shelling it, so I'm a little used to it. But just if I can just finish this point, there's a lot of banging going on, but anyway, we'll keep going.
Gaza was in the background in that clip, and the rocket appeared to come from in front of Douglas Murray. So I'm not sure if I would trust his assertion that it was a rocket coming from the Palestinian side. But either way, cosplaying as a war reporter is pretty gross. Palestinian journalists in Gaza are being killed at a rate of one a day. Douglas Murray's job is just to stand on a relatively peaceful hill overlooking the human catastrophe in Gaza, all while dehumanizing its victims and humanizing the literal Nazis. Aaron, we try not to spend too much time on this show just talking about ridiculous things that awful right-wingers have said. But this is a guy who's been on Talk TV. This was published in the Jewish Chronicle, completely bizarre. And what he has said is just so extreme. And, I don't want to tar everyone who's been supporting Israel over the past 4 weeks to say, they're all the same as Douglas Murray. I don't like this habit of sort of taking the most extreme person from a movement and saying that means that everyone believes that. But I do think there is an obvious connection, which is the only way I think you can look at the death, the destruction being rained upon children in Gaza, is if you do employ a racist dehumanization of Palestinians. I don't really see the way that you can really do that, the way that you can emotionally live with what Israel are doing if you don't have some sort of racial hierarchy in your head. So while Douglas Murray is clearly an extreme example, especially in terms of Israel's cheerleaders in the West, I'm not sure what discourse is like in Israel at the moment, but in terms of discourse here, he's extreme. But I don't think it's completely alien from other things that are going on. And I suppose the evidence of that is that he gets published, right? It wasn't the case that the Jewish Chronicle thought this is so extreme. Of course, we're not going to publish this sort of soft defense of the humanity of Nazis in the Jewish Chronicle, but they went and did it because it served an argument which helped to dehumanize and vilify the Palestinians.
Well, he's being published in what are ultimately quite marginal outlets, Michael. So the New York Post is, just a right-wing, batshit publication in the United States. He's there on Talk TV, Murdoch-owned outlet. And of course, Jewish Chronicle is a marginal newspaper in terms of circulation, its politics, and its relationship to IPSO and media regulations. It's had a significant number of complaints over the years, outsized number given its readership. This comparison as well, Michael, not just to the Nazis, but the SS, I find really extraordinary. And I think it's intentionally provocative. And I think you're right, it serves a dual purpose. So firstly, how can you legitimize potentially killing 1% of a civilian population in 1 month? Killing 4,000 kids, at least. How can you? You can't. Unless, of course, you say, well, no, these people are actually worse than the Nazis. And not just any old Nazis, Michael, the SS. The people that were building the stationary sort of gas chambers, right? Dr. Mengele, Joseph Mengele, who is doing human experiments at Birkenau on Jewish children. He was amputating Jewish children, infecting them with diseases to see what happened, removing organs from them while they were alive. I know this sounds like I'm making it up. I'm not. The definition of a monster, of pure, unadulterated evil. He was in the SS. The people that were manning the concentration camps, Waffen-SS. So the worst of the worst within the Third Reich. And he's saying Hamas is worse than these people. And I think that level of hyperbole isn't an accident. I think he knows exactly what he is doing. He has to reach for the worst possible analog in European history, in the whole of European history, which I think is what the SS are. I think that's the worst possible example you would give of unadulterated evil in order to add a veneer of legitimacy to what's going on. And like you say, it's part of the dehumanization. I think, yes, that's partly racial and it's partly political, because I think one of the few shared, agreed points of historical fact amongst modern Europeans is that, the Third Reich was bad and the SS were the worst of the worst. But the idea that a child who is bombed and dies in its bed is somehow worse than Dr. Joseph Mengele, I mean, it just stretches the boundaries of credulity for even the most rabid Islamophobes. And that's why he's not being published and saying these things, these particular lines and these words, even in outlets like the Telegraph or the Times or the Mail. I mean, that is an extraordinary thing to say. And I think actually any sensible person, particularly any person who lived through all of that, would find it not just distasteful, but disgusting. And I think he is a disgusting man. And people who watch this show, who know me, who know what Novara stands for, will know fully well I enjoy talking to conservatives. I genuinely enjoy talking to people I disagree with. I genuinely enjoy talking to people with a very different perspective on life. I like talking to Peter Hitchens. Sometimes I do GB News with him. We will have a good chat before and after the show. I enjoy talking to him. He's read books I've never even heard of and would never randomly think of wanting to read. I think, oh, that's kind of interesting. Okay. Oh, you're saying there's a Zionist history of the Nakba. He would say, pinch of salt, but it's very different to perhaps what you've read. Okay, Peter, thanks. With Douglas Murray, Michael, it's not just somebody who I politically disagree with. I've never heard in more than 10, 12, maybe even 15 years of seeing this guy in circulation, certainly more than a decade. I've never heard him say a nice thing about anyone. He's one of the most nasty, spiteful, sadistic people in the public sphere in this country. Sadistic. I don't use that word lightly. I've never heard him say a nice thing about anyone. He's nasty, horrible. It just oozes from him this sense of just misanthropy. I can see no redeeming qualities in the man. And I say that as a Christian. I meant to see that in everyone. And frankly, I almost always do. But he seems a uniquely odious and horrid individual. And I think it says something that actually he seems to have risen to the top over the last several weeks in making these public apologia for what's going on in Israel on the behalf of the IDF. I think, firstly, not many people would do it, but I think now he's really in his element. You want somebody to discard the humanity of Palestinian children? I'm your guy. And I think it says something as well, Michael, about the direction of the public sphere in this country. The fact that he's on Talk TV, the fact he's in the New York Post. Okay, that's not the UK, but it's owned by Murdoch. And I think Murdoch, if he had his way, would give somebody like Douglas Murray. He appears very often on Talk TV. I think he would give somebody like Douglas Murray a show. That is a very concerning thing for me because, like I say, it's not just about political disagreement. I can handle that. Often I'll have a political disagreement with people and I recognize they're still good people. They still look after their kids. They're still a good friend. They can still make other people in their lives happy. I'm genuinely at a kind of existential level. Who does this man make happy? What are his redeeming features? It's just his life just seems a perennial exercise in generating hatred, division, and animosity. The thing he said about the Scottish First Minister as well and his wife. I mean, what, do you know them particularly well? I would never talk about somebody like that if I didn't have a decent read on who they were. Even Douglas Murray, if we met, I would hope that I'm wrong, that my mind would be changed. But he is, I think, a uniquely malevolent figure in the British media landscape, Michael. I think that's really saying something quite extraordinary, isn't it?
Yeah, I just want to say for accuracy's sake, so I think you sort of suggested that he was comparing the SS to Palestinian Gazan children. I imagine he would say, no, I was comparing them to Hamas. It's very different. He presumably wouldn't compare Gazan children to the SS. But I do think this is all part and parcel of dehumanizing the Palestinians, even if that wouldn't have been the exact comparison that he did make. I want to show you one more clip of Douglas Murray. My apologies for that. And that's because he repeats what has become a common talking point on the far right.
They come up with this idea, for instance, that there are indigenous people who were moved out. The Palestinians are indigenous people, and they were moved out by the Jews, the Israelis, the Zionists. And this version is, of course, a replay of that version of American history, which is there were the Edenic first populations of America, the indigenous peoples, and then people from Europe came, the wicked Spanish and Italians and Portuguese and the French and even the British. Come and do their thing. And so they just put this version of history onto the Middle East. To those people, I would say, fine, you can do that if you want. Now let's do Britain. Want to play that game? You sure? You better not get the British started. But that's
Tell me
one
more,
version.
Douglas. What do you mean?
You want to play the indigenous people own the land first game and the other people should fuck off? Well, it's 60 years of mass migration into the UK. Who are the indigenous peoples of the UK? People who've been here the longest. Who are the settlers? Who are the illegal settlers in Britain? Oh, well, that would be the people who've arrived. Does anyone want to go there?
I would be happy to go there because the situations are so fundamentally different, right? It's just ridiculous to say they are not. And again, I say the reason we're showing you this is because I have had a bunch of idiots on Twitter sort of reply to my post such as this. Oh, so you're against illegal settlements, and then what about people migrating to Britain? Well, if people were migrating to Britain and were bullying people out of their homes, were forcing people out of their houses at gunpoint, right, so they could take them over themselves, and then excluding people from towns on the basis of their ethnicity. If people were doing that, I'd have a problem with it, right? I would have a problem with anyone moving to Britain and saying, oh, we actually have an exclusive right to this town. You have to move, right? We're going to force you out. We're going to expel you. If people were doing that, they would be settlers and it would be a problem. What we have in Britain is we have people who move here and they don't make the people already here do anything differently. Right? Yeah, they changed the culture a bit. I personally love that. But they are not settlers because they are not trying to take the land for themselves and expel other people from that land. And in the case of Israel, you've got people who were settling that land and then expelling people from that land explicitly on the base of race and ethnicity. They say this is now Jewish land, and if you're not Jewish, you have to piss off, right? You can't be in this town. You can't even be near this town. We're going to have our soldiers point their guns at you, right? If that was happening in Britain, I would have a problem with it. It's not.